our founding fathers had some things in common. They were from typically a European ancestry. They understood their history, and they were trying to avoid bringing that history to this country. The world in which they lived was, you typically had a king, a court, which was a small group of people around the king, and then the great unwashed. That would be me and you probably. These people, they knew that for centuries in Europe, the kings had fought with kings, the king and pope had fought with that king, then that king and the pope had fought with this king, and it was just a non-ending warfare with each other, where the people were just used as pawns. Some historians have said, well, our founding fathers, they arranged a form of government in this country that would serve to preserve their power and their wealth. Well, let's think about that for a minute. At that time of our founding fathers, you had a king sitting on the throne in England, a king in Spain, a king in France, a king in Prussia, a czarina in Russia, an emperor in China, and a shogun in Japan. This was not a world that was really conducive to individual rights and limited government. So the idea that our founders somehow came up with this form of government because it would have some kind of self-interest or benefit to them personally, I think is a real stretch. What our founders did have in common, with maybe the possible exception of Mr. Hamilton again, is they knew their history well enough to know that what they wanted to do was create a system in this country where power was dispersed and could not be centralized. Because the greatest fear they shared was a centralization of power. Well, that got us off to a good start. And it went for about 135 years. And then we had another philosophy come on the scene, and that's called progressivism. This is a movement to progress or move beyond the political principles of the American founding. It's to vastly enlarge the scope of the national government with the purpose and ends of that government to be redefined every generation. The progressives were the first people to come out and openly attack the Declaration of Independence. They were the first people to come out and openly attack the Constitution. They openly attacked the Founding Fathers and are still doing that today. If there was a year in this country's history that I think was the demarcation point from the founders to the progressives, I think it was probably 1913. In 1913, you had a number of really nasty things happen. You had Woodrow Wilson go into office as the president. The 16th Amendment was ratified. That created the income tax, which allowed the federal government to have a independent source of funding. You had the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators, which we're going to come back to a little bit later. And in that same year, you also had the Federal Reserve Bank being set up. So this was a blow. Every one of those was a blow to what our founders stood for. One of the central tenets of progressivism, which is kind of laughable today, is that due to historical progress, government is no longer a danger to the governed. A rather odd conclusion given the fact that in the 20th century, more than 100 million people were killed, not in wars, but by their own government. 100 million people in a century. And you can figure that one out for yourself. Add up Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Cambodia, I'm losing the guy's name right now, Pol Pot, and then just tons of other little dictators all over the world that to gain power and then to keep power, they had to purge their own populations. So I'm not sure we can say that the 20th century shows that government is no longer a danger to the governed. In fact, I think it would be fairly easy to make the argument that the 20th century was probably the most barbaric century in the history of the world.